There are many different ways to manipulate objects within View, so let's go ahead and take a look at those different options right now. If we go over here to the left, we see our Terrain tab. I'm just going to load in a standard terrain, which is the first in our options. And we don't really need procedural terrain right now because we're not too concerned about the actual detail of this terrain, more about the speed and how it works within View's interface, because a standard terrain will work a lot better and faster than a procedural terrain as far as when you're actually editing your scene and when you're rendering. I'm going to move the mouse over to the left side of the screen and click on the front view, which will allow us to see our gizmo and its overall transformation options on the right. These will pop up depending on which window you have selected. So as I select the different windows, we can see that all of these different options show up in the selected window. Our first row of options is dependent on what type of object we have and also its relation to the scene and other objects we have selected in the scene. We have parent, local, global, and camera. And we're going to come back to these, and we just want to make sure that we have parent selected right now, which is our top option. And we're going to come over to the right where we have another row of 3 more options. And we have move, rotate, and scale. And each one of these will change the gizmo a different way for a different visual aid. And the gizmo's size can also be changed depending on how closely you're working with a certain object. What we can actually do is go over to the number pad and use the plus and minus keys to make our gizmo larger and smaller. And this is very helpful if you're working with several different types of objects in your scene and you have some overlapping objects, or if, in this case, I can move our gizmo down so it's very small, and in this case we won't really be able to select it very easily if there's other objects around it. So by making it larger, we'll be able to actually go into the sky and select these different manipulators to move around our object. Let's go ahead and take a look at what each one of these does, making sure that we have parent selected and, of course, move on the right. We're going to select our z-axis right now. If you go ahead and click on that, you can see that it constrains to that z-axis, which is the up and down, and we can just move our object on that axis only. If we come to the other ones, let's just go up to the top view so we can see that a little bit easier. I'm also going to make our gizmo just a little bit larger. But if we have our red, which is our x-axis, and we can just go ahead and change that. And then our y-axis, which will allow us to change it and constrain it directly on the y. We can also use more than one combination. By going to the center here, and we have this large area selected and lit up, we can select that, which will allow us to manipulate on the x and the y. And then if we go down to the front view, we can manipulate on the z and the x. And of course, same thing with the side view where we have the z and the y-axis. So it's different ways of constraining our object and editing them in relation to our grid, and of course, just being more accurate overall about it. Now our next option is rotate, which pretty much works the same way. We have 3 different directions to rotate and 3 different gizmos that we can use to actually manipulate it. And to give you a little better idea of what these options are actually doing numerically to the object's properties, we're going to go up to the center tab up here. It looks like a little measuring ruler. And that way we can see our position, our orientation, our size, and twist. And then, of course, our pivot position, which we'll go over a little bit later. And we are going to select our orientation, which is our second one down, because that's what we're using within the actual interface. Is, of course, rotation, which is orientation of the object. And move is position, which is our top one. And then, of course, our size is our last one. So let's take a look at our rotation, and we can see our actual numbers right here, which we can manipulate our object this way as well. We could do it numerically. I could edit our pitch. But if I go into our camera view right now, we can also edit the pitch just by selecting that red line we have in there, that red circle. And if we select our other different options, we can move along. Right now we're on the green, which is manipulating our y-axis mostly. And of course we can go over and numerically and adjust the so we can either go into our major interface and control these objects, or we can use the the numeric options we have available within the interface, options of this object. And now we're going to switch to the scale. And we can do this on any of the different viewports. I'm going to do it on the top view. We'll select our scale. And you can see that it's a little bit different. And what we also have is our axes still staying exactly where they were. We can see the Y is still the Y-axis where it was before because the object was rotated. Well, that's what some of these other options have to do with the object in the first column. So we can take a look at local, global, and camera. And now local is dependent on how many objects we have selected. If we have more than one object selected in our scene, then this was very important, which we'll show in just a sec. Let's take a look at our global and camera. If we look at global, we'll see that it resets our axes back to the overall world axes and not the actual object's axes. So we can switch back and forth between those, depending if you still want to manipulate this object. If we needed to stretch it in this direction, of course, that would be the easiest way, because if we were using the global, then it would, of course, skew that object, and it wouldn't look as it's supposed to. And then what our camera option does is makes all this in relation to the camera. So therefore, the easiest way to really see this is to actually use the move. So we're going to move this object, and now our axes will allow us to go up and down on the camera, and then left and right of the camera, and then of course closer to the camera, and then farther away. So it changes these axes in relation to the camera and where the camera is pointing. And that way it's a little bit easier to do little changes where we just want to move it maybe a little bit to the left, but it might not be the right axis if our camera is manipulated in a different manner. So we'll go ahead and just kind of change the camera around, and we can see the axes change as we switch camera mode to other modes. But now we're going to go back to that sizing option, and I'm going to go to our top viewport, and I'm going to change, actually I'm going to go back to our orientation, just change this object back to sort of its default state. It's a little bit skewed, but that's alright. Now we're going to go back to that scale. And now that we have it set on our parent right now, we can go ahead and just scale overall by using the center area, or we can scale the specific axes by using the second area, which will just allow us right now to edit our X and Y axis. And then if we go to our other viewport, we'll be editing our Z and X axis. And then of course the side view, we have our Z and Y. And then we come in the center, we can still make it larger overall. And we also have our individual axes, and then we can just change specifically to that area. So if we just want to move this up, we can just scale that on the Z. If we want to move up the Z and the X and sort of stretch it out a little, we can do that by using this extra little selection area on the outer selection area. Now I'm going to delete this terrain object, and we want to load in a different object, and actually just two objects, so that we can see the difference between local and parent transformations. I'm just going to load in two spheres, size down our gizmo, and then add another sphere. And now what I'm going to do is select both of these objects. And let's take a look at the manipulations set to parent. Move is going to be exactly the same, the two objects together. If we go to rotate, you'll see that our outer object is rotating around this other object right here. So it actually depends on which object you have selected first, too. So if we select this object first and then rotate, you'll see that it rotates around the other object. So we can switch that and change that back and forth. And we can see with local that our objects rotate by themselves. And then, as you can see, go back to parent, rotating around the other object. And that's the major difference between our local and parent transformations, and it allows us to do a little bit of different editing while we're working with multiple objects and we have multiple objects selected. So there's a lot of different little tricks we can do with that, and just little things that make it easier to, of course, work within View and work on your scenes.